Allow your eyes to gently close and let the heavy burdens of the modern world slip away into the dark. Let your mind drift back almost 1,000 years, crossing the vast oceans of time to arrive in a world that is both startlingly familiar and deeply strange. We find ourselves in the twilight of the 11th century, standing on the precipice of the 12th, an age defined by the brutal, earth-shaking collision of faith and empire. Across the dense forests and stone castles of Europe, a fervent cry has begun to echo. Banners bearing the cross are being raised against grey skies as thousands of heavily armored knights take solemn vows, preparing their steeds and sharpening their steel to march eastward in a holy crusade. Meanwhile, across the sun-baked expanses of the Middle East, the geopolitical landscape is a boiling cauldron of ambition and rivalry. Great, sprawling dynasties struggle endlessly for ultimate supremacy. Powerful sultans clash with ancient caliphs, their massive armies marching across the dunes, while stoic, sun-bleached desert castles stand as silent sentinels watching over long-established caravan trade routes. This was an era drowning in noise. It was defined by the deafening sound of cavalry charges, the metallic shriek of swords striking against iron-banded shields, and the interwoven, desperate calls of priests and imams summoning their faithful to prayer amidst the chaos. And yet, perfectly concealed within that turbulent theater of kings and conquerors, a completely different kind of power was quietly taking root. This power commanded no vast, sweeping armies. It held no sprawling territories or wealthy, walled cities. Yet, it possessed a terrifying capability. It could strike more dread into the heart of a heavily guarded ruler than the sight of 10,000 enemy soldiers massing on the horizon. It was not a sovereign nation, nor was it a noble dynasty. It was something far more elusive, something born in the shadows. To simply speak its name aloud in the grand courts of the East was to invite an immediate, chilling unease. That name was whispered by nervous merchants traveling the long, desolate caravan roads. It was muttered by weary pilgrims making their perilous way to holy shrines. And it was written, with trembling hands, into the ink-stained chronicles of Crusader knights. It was the name of the Assassins. They were entirely unlike any other military or political force of their time. The Assassins did not ride into open battle with glorious cavalry charges, nor did they patiently lay siege to fortified cities using massive wooden catapults. Their strength never lay in overwhelming numbers. In fact, they were always remarkably few. Their true strength lay in absolute precision, unfathomable devotion, and the long, dark shadows they managed to cast across the collective imagination of an age already steeped in fear and superstition. To their sworn enemies, they were nothing short of monsters, demons wearing human skin. To their devoted followers, they were selfless martyrs, holy warriors sacrificing themselves for a divine truth. And to the world beyond the mountains, they evolved into a legend so incredibly enduring that the very word assassin still lives and breathes in our modern languages today. But who were these phantoms of the medieval world? Were they merely cold-blooded killers for hire, soulless blades in the night devoid of loyalty? Or were they part of something much greater, a tight-knit brotherhood bound by an unbreakable faith, carrying a vision of truth that a handful of men were willing to die to protect? To even begin to understand this mysterious order, we must look to the architect who forged them. We must examine the man whose life story blurs the line between historical fact and enduring myth. His name was Hasan-i Sabbah. He was born in the ancient lands of Persia, stepping into a world that was already deeply fractured by endless wars and rigid theological divisions. The year was approximately 1050, though the exact moment of his birth remains lost to the shifting sands of time. Historical accounts offer conflicting whispers of his origins. Some claim his family held to Shia traditions from the start, while others suggest he was raised in the Sunni orthodoxy before finding a divergent path. What remains undisputed is that, from a remarkably early age, Hassan possessed a restless, insatiable intellect. He was drawn to the pursuit of knowledge with a fierce intensity. He did not merely study theology. His mind sought the underlying mechanics of the universe. He threw himself into the abstract elegance of mathematics, mapped the celestial heavens through astronomy, and unraveled the dense arguments of philosophy, mastering all the recognized sciences of his era. He was a man who constantly questioned the established order, a debater who argued passionately, and a seeker looking for absolute truth in a world where truth was fiercely contested and often violently suppressed. To live in the Persia of the 11th century was to live surrounded by sharp, unforgiving divisions. The mighty Seljuk Turks, a formidable force of nomadic warriors turned empire builders, dominated the region. They were staunch defenders of the Sunni branch of Islam, enforcing their religious orthodoxy with the full, crushing weight of their military might. Meanwhile, in the grand city of Baghdad, the Abbasid caliphs still sat upon their ancient thrones. Though their actual political influence had severely weakened, they maintained a potent symbolic authority over the Islamic world. Yet, beneath the glittering surface of these massive empires, a different reality existed. The shadows were home to persecuted minorities and hidden, secretive sects. Prominent among these underground communities were the Ismailis, a specific branch of Shia Islam. The Ismailis held a profound, defining belief in a living, unbroken line of imams, divinely guided heirs who possessed esoteric, hidden knowledge of the universe, knowledge that was deliberately concealed from the corrupt, wider world. Hassan's relentless search for meaning eventually led him toward this very Ismaili faith. But to follow such a path within the borders of the Seljuk Empire was a supremely dangerous, often deadly choice. The ruling Seljuks viewed the Ismailis not merely as misguided believers, but as dangerous heretics and fundamental enemies of the state. They were a people to be hunted down, silenced, and ruthlessly suppressed. However, rather than deterring him, this looming danger only served to forge Hassan's convictions into unbreakable steel. He transitioned from a seeker to a dedicated missionary, a persuasive teacher, a man who risked his life daily to spread this forbidden, hidden creed among those who were brave enough to listen in the dark. His fierce passion and undeniable charisma quickly made him a marked man. He became a fugitive in his own land, perpetually pursued by Seljuk agents, always looking over his shoulder, never truly knowing a moment of safety. Driven by this constant peril, Hassan began to envision something far more substantial than just a hidden network of terrified believers. He began to dream of a physical, unassailable sanctuary. He sought a fortress where his persecuted people could live, study, and worship, entirely free from the constant terror of the Seljuk sword, a high place where the reach of their powerful, heavily armed enemies would finally fall short. This desperate, burning dream would eventually lead him away from the crowded, dusty cities and bustling markets of the plains. It drove him deep into the hostile, treacherous terrain of the Alborz mountains, a jagged spine of stone separating the Iranian plateau from the Caspian Sea. There, in the remote, rugged, and fiercely independent valleys of northern Persia, his searching eyes would find exactly what his brilliant mind had envisioned. Rising violently from the earth, perched atop a sheer, near-vertical pillar of solid rock, stood an ancient, imposing fortress. It was a stronghold that seemed to grow organically out of the mountain itself, its walls touching the heavens, looking down upon the sprawling fields and winding rivers far below. To take such a fortress by conventional military force would be an impossible nightmare. Its name was Alamut, the eagle's nest. To stand at the base of the rock of Alamut is to feel the insignificance of mortal ambition. The stone rises sheer and unforgiving, a vertical defiance of the valley floor below. For decades, it had been a remote outpost, a garrison that belonged to the Seljuk Empire, deemed impenetrable by sheer force of geography. To assault, it would require an army to march single file up treacherous, winding paths, exposed to a rain of arrows and boiling oil from the defenders above. Hasan-i Sabbah knew this. He also knew he possessed no such army. He had no siege engines, no vast wealth to hire mercenaries, and no heavy cavalry. But Hasan possessed a weapon far more potent than catapults or iron. He possessed time, and he possessed the spoken word. The capture of Alamut was not an event of fire and blood. It was a masterpiece of psychological infiltration. Around the year 1090, Hasan did not order a charge. Instead, he deployed his followers, the devoted missionaries, into the surrounding valley of Dalam. Like water seeping into the imperceptible cracks of a boulder, they slowly permeated the region. They spoke to the locals, they shared their faith, and crucially, they began to speak to the garrison of Alamut itself. Over months, the invisible siege tightened. The soldiers within the fortress, isolated in the clouds and disillusioned by the distant, corrupt rule of the Seljuks, found themselves captivated by the quiet conviction of Hasan's followers. According to tradition, Hasan himself eventually slipped inside the walls. He moved quietly among the guards, planting seeds of doubt against their distant masters and offering the profound, intoxicating promise of a righteous cause. When the Seljuk commander of Alamut finally realized what was happening, it was already too late. He awoke to find that the fortress he commanded no longer belonged to him. The swords of his own garrison were no longer sworn to the Sultan. Their loyalties had been captured from within. It was a bloodless shift of power that would soon echo like thunder across the medieval world. The commander was allowed to leave, and the eagle's nest was finally Hasan's. Yet, capturing the fortress was only the first breath of a much larger vision. Almost immediately, Hasan set about transforming Alamut from a mere military garrison into something the world had never seen. The high stone walls were heavily fortified, yes, but the true defenses were built within the minds of the men who inhabited it. Alamut became an intellectual sanctuary, a monastic fortress suspended above the clouds. While the world below tore itself apart with broadswords and cavalry charges, Hasan filled his mountaintop refuge with teachers, books, rare manuscripts, and scrolls. He ordered the construction of expansive libraries, quiet chambers for theological debate, and spaces to study the brilliant stars of the Persian night. Philosophy, astronomy, advanced mathematics, and theology were studied with the same ferocious intensity as the physical arts of stealth and endurance, for Hasan believed that a blunted mind was as useless as a blunted sword. The men he gathered around him were not unthinking killers. They were scholars, debaters, and philosophers who had chosen the path of ultimate resistance. But this intellectual haven was not a place of comfort. The air at Alamut was thin and cold, and the life forged within its walls was governed by an absolute, unrelenting austerity. Hasan-i Sabbah ruled his domain with an iron conviction that tolerated no softness. He demanded total discipline, silence, and an uncompromising dedication to their cause. Laughter, indulgence, and earthly pleasures were viewed as dangerous distractions that could corrupt the spirit. It was a life stripped down to its barest essentials, entirely focused on survival and divine purpose. Hasan applied this ruthless discipline first and foremost to himself. Chroniclers of the age, even those who despised him, noted that he lived the life of an ascetic, denying himself luxury, dressing plainly, and dedicating his every waking moment to the preservation of his people. His commitment was terrifyingly absolute. When members of his own family broke the strict codes of the fortress, Hasan did not spare them from the ultimate punishment. To the outside world, it was an act of unfathomable coldness. To the inhabitants of Alamut, it was a harrowing demonstration that no one, not even the blood of the master, was above the survival of the movement. This was the forge in which the assassins were shaped. Hasan realized a fundamental, brutal truth of his era. In an open field, his small community would be slaughtered by the tens of thousands of Seljuk soldiers. They could not win a war of attrition. They could not conquer cities. Therefore, they had to change the very nature of war itself. If an empire was a towering beast, Hasan reasoned, you do not attack its thick, armored hide. You strike directly at the brain. The strategy of targeted assassination was born not out of mere violence, but out of cold, mathematical survival. It was a doctrine of psychological warfare completely foreign to the conventional armies of the day. Why sacrifice 1,000 brave men on a battlefield to defeat a hostile army when a single, perfectly placed dagger could cut down the general who commanded it? By eliminating the specific individuals who wielded power against them, corrupt viziers, aggressive commanders, and hostile governors, Hasan could paralyze the colossal military machine of his enemies. But it was not simply the act of killing that made the assassins the most feared entity in the known world. It was the terrifyingly intimate manner in which they carried out their strikes. The initiates of Alamut, the men chosen to walk the path of the dagger, were trained to an unparalleled degree of physical and mental fortitude. Once they committed to the order, all ties to their past lives, their families, and their personal ambitions were severed. They were bound entirely to their brothers and their leader. When the moment came to strike, they did not attack from the shadows with a poisoned arrow. They did not hire mercenaries to do their bloody work. They stepped forward in the blazing light of day. They sought out their targets in crowded markets, grand public squares, or the heavily guarded halls of palaces. They closed the distance, drew a hidden dagger, and delivered the fatal blow face to face. Then came the detail that truly broke the minds of kings and sultans. The assassin made absolutely no attempt to escape. Having fulfilled their mission, they stood their ground, waiting calmly to be cut down by the target's horrified guards. They did not flee, they embraced their own destruction. This singular, chilling fact shifted the foundation of medieval power. An empire can build higher walls, it can forge thicker armor, it can hire 10,000 guards. But how do you fight an enemy who places no value on his own survival? How do you terrify a man who views death not as an end, but as a doorway to eternal fulfillment? You cannot. And so, the terror flowed the other way. The psychological weight of Alamut settled over the Middle East like a suffocating shroud. The fear became a weapon sharper than any blade. Powerful men who commanded vast armies began to shudder at the sight of an unfamiliar face in the crowd. They eyed their closest advisors, their servants, their most trusted guards with gnawing, paranoid suspicion. The invisible army of Hasan-i Sabbah had achieved the impossible. They had made the untouchables of the world realize that their lives hung by a single, fragile thread. The terror that bled from the jagged peaks of Alamut could not remain an abstract concept for long. Fear, to be truly effective, requires a demonstration. It demands a canvas upon which the brutal reality of the threat can be painted for all the world to see. And in the closing years of the 11th century, Hasan-i Sabbah chose his canvas with devastating precision. The target was not a mere foot soldier, nor a minor governor of a distant, dusty province. To announce the arrival of his shadow empire, Hasan aimed at the very summit of the known world. He turned his eyes toward the beating heart of the Seljuk Empire, and specifically to the man who orchestrated its immense, crushing power, the Grand Vizier, Nizam al-Mulk. At this moment in history, the Seljuk Empire was a titan that bestrode the Middle East. It was an unstoppable military juggernaut of nomadic cavalry and heavily armored lancers, stretching from the borders of Anatolia deep into the heart of Central Asia. Yet, behind the glittering thrones and silken pavilions of the Seljuk Sultans, it was the brilliant, calculating mind of Nizam al-Mulk that truly governed this vast expanse. He was a statesman of unparalleled intellect, the architect of the empire's laws, its sprawling universities, and its grand geopolitical strategies. For decades, his word had been law. His authority was absolute. and his network of spies and informants was whispered to be omniscient. Nizam al-Mulk was not a foolish man, nor was he blind to the shifting tides of his empire. He recognized the quiet, creeping danger radiating from the Alborz mountains. While arrogant generals scoffed at the small numbers of the Ismailis, the vizier understood the lethal, infectious geometry of Hasan-i Sabbah's growing influence. He had long sought to crush the sect, deploying orthodox scholars to condemn them as heretics and dispatching formidable military forces to besiege their remote outposts. He sought to tear Alamut down stone by stone, to erase them from the map. To the vizier, Hassan and his followers were a pestilence that needed to be surgically removed from the empire before the infection could spread. He did not realize that the scalpel was already poised at his own throat. The year was 1092. The Seljuk court was in transit, an awe-inspiring spectacle of power moving like a slow thunderhead across the plains of Persia. The Sultan's royal encampment was a moving city of thousands of hardened soldiers, roaring war horses, and an impenetrable ring of elite bodyguards whose only purpose in this world was to protect the sovereign and his grand vizier. The air was thick with the scent of roasting meats, the harsh clang of blacksmiths repairing heavy chainmail, and the rhythmic footfalls of the greatest military force on earth. Surrounded by this insurmountable sea of steel and muscle, Nizam al-Mulk rested in what he believed to be absolute, unshakable security. Through this chaotic, heavily militarized labyrinth, a solitary figure walked. He did not wear the polished armor of a warrior or the rich, embroidered silks of a noble courtier. Instead, he was dressed in the rough, unassuming woolen robes of a wandering Sufi mystic. His head was bowed in apparent piety, his hands tucked away, his steps measured and slow. To the hardened guards watching the perimeter, he was invisible, just another holy man seeking alms, a common, harmless sight in the sprawling retinue of the royal court. He was allowed to pass. He moved silently through the outer rings of defense, gliding past the heavy cavalry, past the elite guards with their hands resting easily on the pommels of their curved swords. With the slow, inevitable pull of gravity, he approached the litter of the Grand Vizier. The space between the ascetic and the most powerful man in the empire closed to a mere arm's length. There were no battle cries. There was no grand, theatrical declaration of war. In a motion too fluid and sudden for the human eye to intercept, the coarse wool of the Sufi's robe parted, and cold steel flashed in the Persian sun. The strike was flawless. Nizam al-Mulk, the mastermind of the Seljuk Golden Age, fell back, mortally wounded by a single, devastating blow. For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to freeze in the royal camp. The impossible had just unfolded in front of hundreds of the world's most lethal soldiers. And then, the silence shattered into utter chaos. Shouts of horror and confusion ripped through the hot air. Swords were drawn with the frantic shriek of grinding metal. The vizier's bodyguards swarmed the attacker, hacking him down in a blind frenzy of grief, rage, and disbelief. But the assassin did not run. As the heavy blades descended upon him, there was no panic in his eyes, no desperate scramble for an escape route, no plea for mercy. He had known, from the very moment he left the cold stone gates of Alamut, that he would never see the mountains again. His mission was complete the instant his dagger found its mark. The brutal death of his own body was an irrelevant detail, a final, transcendent act of devotion to the master of the mountain. The assassination of Nizam al-Mulk sent shockwaves of pure terror crashing across the Islamic world. The message written in the vizier's blood was terrifyingly clear. The Seljuk Empire could command armies numbering in the tens of thousands. They could conquer continents and dictate the fate of millions. But they could not protect their own architect. The towering walls, the elite guards, the vast vaults of gold, all of it was rendered utterly meaningless by a single, quiet man who was willing to die. If Nizam al-Mulk could be slaughtered in the very center of his own massive army, surrounded by loyal steel, who among the ruling elite was truly safe. The fear that followed was a creeping, suffocating paralysis. The fundamental rules of power had been permanently rewritten. The assassins had proven that they did not need to meet their enemies on a blood-soaked battlefield. They simply had to wait for them to close their eyes. This singular, earth-shattering event codified the terrifying ritual of the Order. The strikes that followed over the coming years adhered strictly to this same, chilling intimacy. The devoted did not use poison slipped into a goblet of wine, for poison could be dismissed as sudden illness or bad food. They did not fire arrows from dark alleyways or high rooftops, for distance implied cowardice and allowed room for doubt. The dagger was always drawn face to face, ensuring the victim looked directly into the calm, unwavering eyes of his executioner in his final moments. It was a demonstration of supreme control. As the mighty Seljuk Empire began to fracture, crippled by internal power struggles and paranoia following the vizier's death, the shadow of Alamut lengthened. Their invisible reach extended far beyond the rugged borders of Persia, stretching steadily westward into the sun-baked landscapes and ancient cities of Syria. The daggers of Hassan's acolytes began to find new targets among the emirs and governors of the Levant. Rulers like Ridwan of Aleppo learned quickly that survival in this terrifying new age required a delicate, humiliating dance with the masters of the mountain. A misstep, a broken promise, or a careless whisper of betrayal could bring the blade to their own bedside before morning. But the assassins were about to encounter an entirely new kind of enemy, a force completely alien to the delicate, shifting politics of the Middle East was currently marching across the horizon, carrying banners of the cross and wearing heavy chainmail that baked in the unrelenting desert heat. As the great, bloody clash of the Crusades erupted, sweeping away old alliances in a massive tide of holy war, the silent men of the mountain would find themselves entangled in a chaotic conflict that would test the very limits of their deadly art. The armies that poured out of the west at the dawn of the 12th century were entirely unprepared for the world they were entering. To the European knights who had marched thousands of miles across scorching plains and jagged mountain passes, war was a matter of brute force. It was decided by the thunderous charge of heavy destriers, the splintering of ashwood lances, and the sheer, crushing weight of iron and chainmail. When they arrived in the Levant, they brought this mentality with them, violently carving out new Christian kingdoms along the sun-baked coastlines of the Mediterranean. They built massive, towering citadels of thick limestone, fortresses designed to dominate the landscape and project an aura of invincible European might. To these Crusaders, the enemies they faced were clearly defined. They were the Seljuk emirs of the north and the Fatimid caliphs of the south. The knights believed that if they could simply build their walls high enough and hold their shield walls firm enough, their newly conquered lands would remain secure. But the Crusaders were utterly blind to the war being fought in the shadows. By the time the heavy boots of the European invaders marched through the dust of Antioch and Jerusalem, the invisible empire of Alamut had already spread its roots deep into Syrian soil. The successors of Hasan-i Sabbah recognized early on that their survival depended on expansion. Staying isolated in the Persian Alborz mountains meant eventual strangulation by the surrounding sunny powers. They needed a foothold in the chaotic, fractured landscape of the Levant. Moving westward, the missionaries of the Order did not march like conquering armies. They arrived as merchants, as wandering ascetics, as scholars. They seeped into the Anuseiria Mountains, a rugged, unforgiving spine of peaks running parallel to the Mediterranean coast. Just as they had done at Alamut, they looked for isolated, defensible strongholds. Through a slow, methodical campaign of calculated purchases, cunning diplomacy, and sudden, precise violence, the assassins acquired a string of their own impregnable fortresses in Syria. They seized remote castles like Cadmus and Al-Kaf, But the most formidable among them, perched high upon a rocky spur overlooking a deep, commanding valley, would become their new regional heart. Its name was Masyaf. As the dust of the First Crusade settled, a strange and deeply volatile geopolitical chessboard emerged in the Middle East. On one side were the newly established Crusader states, aggressive and ever-expanding. On the other were the fragmented Muslim dynasties, desperately trying to unite and push the invaders back into the sea. In the middle of this swirling vortex of holy war and territorial ambition sat the assassins. To the orthodox, Muslim rulers of Aleppo and Damascus, the Crusaders were brutal invaders, but the assassins were treacherous heretics, a rot from within that needed to be purged just as urgently. To the Crusaders, the assassins were at first merely a rumor, an exotic whisper traded by local spies and native merchants. The heavily armored lords of Europe initially dismissed tales of invisible killers as the superstitious ramblings of the local populace. That arrogant dismissal would not last long. The assassins did not view the Crusader invasion through the simple, binary lens of religious warfare. Where the Seljuks saw an existential threat to Islam, the masters of Masyaf and Alamut saw opportunity. They were pragmatists of the highest order. Their absolute, overriding priority was not the victory of a specific empire, but the survival of their own hidden community. To achieve that survival, they were willing to make deals with anyone. Loyalty to the assassins was a luxury they could not afford. The shifting landscape of the Crusades became a grand, bloody theater in which they could play the great powers against one another. If a powerful Muslim emir in Aleppo was preparing a military campaign to crush the Ismaili strongholds in the mountains, the assassins would not hesitate to reach out to the Christian lords of Antioch. Suddenly, a quiet envoy from the mountains would arrive at the gates of a Crusader castle, offering gold, vital intelligence, or a temporary truce. The Crusaders, constantly outnumbered and eager for any tactical advantage, often accepted. For a time, the Christian knights and the phantom killers of the mountains would find themselves acting as uneasy allies, united only by a common enemy. But the moment the balance of power shifted, the moment a Crusader prince became too ambitious, threatening the borders of assassin territory or demanding unacceptable tributes, the alliance would evaporate like morning mist. The Christian lords would suddenly find themselves marked. It was a terrifying awakening for the nobility of Europe. They had spent fortunes building castles with walls 10 feet thick, complete with deep moats and heavy iron portcullises. They slept surrounded by heavily armed guards, confident that no army could ever touch them. But the assassins did not need an army. They only needed one man, entirely devoid of the fear of death, willing to wait patiently for weeks or even months, disguised as a stable boy, a humble monk, or a trusted servant. When the blow inevitably fell, it shattered the Crusaders' illusion of safety. The realization began to set in among the highest echelons of the Christian kingdoms. Their wealth, their noble titles, and their massive stone fortresses could not protect them from a blade in the dark. A deep, psychological rot of paranoia began to spread through the courts of Jerusalem, Tripoli, and Antioch. Fearful of the shadows, powerful European barons began wearing heavy chainmail beneath their fine silk tunics, even while dining at grand banquets. The lords of the West were beginning to learn the exact same lesson that the Seljuk Grand Vizier had learned decades earlier in the deserts of Persia. The terror of the dagger was a universal language, understood equally by sultan and king. As the 12th century dragged on, the Syrian branch of the assassins grew increasingly autonomous from their founders in Persia. Separated by hundreds of miles of hostile territory, the fortress of Masyaf became a kingdom unto itself. And it was here, amidst the endless bloodshed and political betrayals of the Crusades, that the Syrian assassins would rise to their absolute zenith. They were about to be led by a man whose sheer cunning, charisma, and mastery of psychological warfare would not only rival the legendary Hasan-i Sabbah, but would cement the name of the order into the darkest, most terrifying pages of Western history. He was a man who would soon stand toe-to-toe with the greatest monarchs of Europe and the most brilliant sultans of the East, orchestrating a symphony of terror that would paralyze the known world. The Crusaders would soon come to know him by a title that struck ice into the veins of the bravest knights. They would call him the Old Man of the Mountain. The coastal city of Tyre in the late spring of 1192 was a boiling intersection of ambition, holy war, and political intrigue. Surrounded by the shimmering, unforgiving blue of the Mediterranean Sea, the city's massive limestone walls stood as a defiant beacon of European power in the Levant. Within this heavily fortified enclave, the surviving nobility of the Crusader states gathered, their armor baked by the eastern sun, their minds occupied with the grand, bloody business of empire building. At the absolute center of this political labyrinth was Conrad of Montferrat. Conrad was not merely a prince. He was the undisputed heavyweight of Crusader politics, a hardened veteran of endless sieges, and a master of diplomatic maneuvering. By the end of April 1192, he had outmaneuvered his rivals, secured the backing of powerful European factions, and stood on the very precipice of ultimate victory. He was to be crowned the King of Jerusalem. This title would have made him the most influential, celebrated, and heavily protected Christian monarch in the East. He was surrounded at all times by a fiercely loyal retinue of hardened knights, men who had survived the worst the desert had to offer. To the common soldiers of the cross, Conrad was untouchable, a towering figure clad in iron who was destined to reclaim the holy city. But in the distant, fog-shrouded peaks of the An-Nusayriya Mountains, a different destiny had already been written for the would-be king. The masters of Masyaf had watched Conrad's meteoric rise with cold, calculating eyes. To the assassins, this consolidation of Crusader power under a single, highly capable and aggressive military leader represented an unacceptable shift in the fragile geopolitical balance. The order was given. The shadow of the mountain was cast toward the sea. On the 28th of April, Conrad walked through the narrow, bustling streets of Tyre. The air was thick with the scent of salt, roasting lamb, and the pressing heat of the crowded city. He was returning from a lavish feast, surrounded by his elite guard, relaxed in the heart of his own heavily fortified stronghold. As the royal procession moved through the winding stone alleys, two figures stepped out from the crowded fringes. They were dressed in the humble, unassuming woolen habits of Christian monks. For months, these two men had lived quietly within the Crusader camp. They had assimilated perfectly, learning the language, mimicking the religious rites, and adopting the mannerisms of the very people they had been sent to destroy. They were invisible, hidden not in the darkness of night, but in the blinding light of extreme piety. As the monks approached the prince, the royal guards parted slightly, making way for the men of God. It was a fatal, momentary lapse in the armor of the Crusader state. With horrifying synchronization, the holy men dropped their act. The humble monks revealed long, meticulously sharpened daggers concealed within the folds of their robes. In a violent blur of motion, they fell upon Conrad before a single knight could draw a sword. The blades found their mark, biting deep into the flesh of the most powerful Christian lord in the Levant. Conrad of Montferrat, the man who was to be king of Jerusalem, collapsed onto the cobblestones, mortally wounded. The streets of Tyre instantly erupted into bedlam. Heavy broadswords were drawn, and the Crusader guards descended upon the killers with blinding rage. One of the assassins was hacked to pieces on the spot. The other was captured, subjected to unimaginable torture, and executed. Yet, right up to their final, agonizing breaths, neither man displayed a flicker of fear. They made no attempt to flee the labyrinthine streets of Tyre. They offered no pleas for mercy. They died with the serene, terrifying calm of men who believed their bloody work had already secured them a place in eternal paradise. The assassination of Conrad of Montferrat struck the courts of Europe like a physical blow. The news spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean, carried by frantic merchant galleys and horrified envoys. It echoed through the grand, vaulted halls of Paris, London, and the Holy Roman Empire. The lords of the West were forced to confront a paralyzing reality. The most fortified city on the coast, ringed by the most experienced knights in Christendom, had failed to protect their chosen king from two men armed with nothing but daggers and absolute conviction. The Crusaders realized, with a creeping sense of dread, that the invisible killers of the mountains were not a localized nuisance. They were an apex predator that could strike anywhere, at any time, penetrating the deepest layers of security to pull down the highest pillars of society. The psychological devastation was absolute. Paranoia infected the Crusader leadership. Whispers filled the war councils. If Conrad could be butchered in broad daylight, who was truly safe? Suddenly, every shadow held a blade. Every servant pouring wine, every priest offering communion, every stable boy tending a warhorse was viewed through a lens of profound suspicion. The assassins had successfully deployed their most devastating weapon. They had turned the Crusaders' imagination against them. This atmosphere of pervasive terror fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of the Crusades. The great monarchs who arrived from Europe, men accustomed to fighting on open battlefields, found themselves forced to navigate an entirely new, unseen dimension of warfare. Among these monarchs was a man whose name was synonymous with martial brilliance and unwavering courage. King Richard, the Lionheart of England. Arriving in the Holy Land to lead the Third Crusade, Richard was a force of nature, a brilliant tactician who broke Muslim armies and captured entire coastlines. Yet even the Lionheart, a man who charged headlong into enemy lines without fear, understood that he could not cross swords with an enemy he could not see. He recognized that the sect controlling the mountain fortresses held a unique, disproportionate power over the fate of the region. Richard the Lionheart, the celebrated champion of Christendom, realized he had to play the assassin's game. According to the chronicles of the age, the English king opened back-channel communications with the masters of Masyaf. In a stunning departure from the rhetoric of holy war, Richard engaged in a delicate, high-stakes diplomatic dance with the very men who had just murdered his rival, Conrad. Whispered rumors and fragmented records suggest that Richard sought to secure the assassin's neutrality, ensuring that his own name was never whispered in the dark chambers of the mountain. Some legends even claim that the assassins offered Richard a formalized pact of protection, guaranteeing that no blade from their order would ever be turned against the English king. It was said that secret envoys slipped into the Crusader camps under the cover of darkness, bearing strange, exotic gifts from the mountains, a silent, chilling acknowledgement of mutual respect between the greatest conventional warrior of the age and the undisputed masters of unconventional warfare. Whether Richard actively commissioned the assassins to eliminate his political rivals, or simply paid them a king's ransom to look the other way, remains one of the great, dark mysteries of the Crusades. But the very fact that the King of England felt compelled to negotiate with them speaks volumes. It was the ultimate testament to the geopolitical weight the assassins had achieved. By the dawn of the 13th century, the assassins had perfected their art. They sat perched in their eagles' nests, looking down upon the burning, blood-soaked plains of the Middle East. Below them, massive armies of Christians and Muslims slaughtered each other in the name of God and empire. The assassins belonged to neither side. They played kings against sultans, trading the lives of powerful men to ensure their own survival. They had become the ultimate arbiters of power, a shadow state that required no massive armies to bend the world to its will. But history is a relentless tide, and no fortress, no matter how high, no matter how feared, can stand forever. While the assassins focused their brilliant, deadly gaze upon the Crusaders and the fractured dynasties of the West, a new sound was beginning to echo from the distant, freezing steppes of the east. It was not the sound of heavily armored knights, nor the chanted prayers of a sultan's army. It was the low, unbroken thunder of 10,000 hooves. A storm was gathering that cared nothing for diplomacy, nothing for daggers, and absolutely nothing for fear. For nearly 2 centuries, the masters of Alamut and Masyaf had orchestrated a breathtaking survival. Suspended precariously between the crushing weight of the Crusader kingdoms and the endless hostility of orthodox Muslim dynasties, they had woven a masterpiece of psychological warfare. They had endured waves of persecution, religious purges, and the unending, chaotic turmoil of the Holy Land. Their fortresses still stood like eagles' nests, perched upon cliffs that seemed entirely unassailable, defended as much by their terrifying reputation as by their high stone walls. But the seeds of their eventual decline were planted deep within the very strategy that had kept them alive. The assassins were brilliant tacticians, but they were fundamentally trapped. Their isolation, which had served as their greatest shield, was also a suffocating prison. They had no vast agricultural heartlands to feed a growing population, no sprawling, wealthy cities to fund massive standing armies, and no extensive borders to retreat behind. Their strength was entirely fixed, an unchanging absolute in a world that was constantly evolving. Their empire was not built on conquered land, but on the razor's edge of a dagger. It was a terrifying, brilliant illusion of power. And if that illusion were ever to shatter, there was no conventional military force waiting to catch them. While the assassins focused their gaze on the delicate, shifting politics of the Levant, their enemies in the Muslim world were beginning to adapt. The great Seljuk Empire had fractured, yes, but new, battle-hardened dynasties were constantly rising to take its place. These new rulers were growing increasingly weary of living under the shadow of the mountain. They were building larger, more disciplined armies and developing new, aggressive strategies. The balance of power was slowly, inevitably tilting. The assassins' diplomatic truces were becoming shorter, more fragile, and harder to maintain. Yet the true end would not come from the Muslim emirs, nor would it come from the heavily armored knights of Europe. The doom of the assassins was currently riding out of the freezing, windswept vastness of the east. When the first whispered rumors of the Mongols reached the high stone towers of Alamut, they were likely met with the same cautious, detached calculation that the assassins applied to everything. Early reports spoke of strange horsemen from the endless steppes of Central Asia, warriors who could ride for days without sleep, who drank the blood of their horses to survive in the desert, and who shot arrows with a mechanical, deadly precision. At first, they were merely a distant curiosity, but as the 13th century deepened, the rumors transformed into a horrific, undeniable reality. The Mongols were not just another migrating tribe or ambitious dynasty. They were a cataclysm, a storm of blood, iron, and ash that swept across the earth with a speed and ferocity that the world had never witnessed. They fell upon the great Khwarezmian Empire, which bordered the Persian lands, and unmade it completely. Thriving metropolises were reduced to smoking ruins in a matter of days. Entire populations vanished, either slaughtered in the streets or driven before the Mongol vanguard as human shields. They erased ancient libraries, burned grand mosques, and flattened palaces until there was nothing left but scorched earth and silence. To the Mongols, terror was not a subtle tool of statecraft. It was not a scalpel to be used with precision, as the assassins used it. To the Horde, terror was a massive, blunt hammer, swung with apocalyptic force to shatter the will of continents. As this unstoppable tide washed toward the borders of Persia, the assassins watched from their impregnable heights. For generations, they had believed that their mountains made them untouchable. They assumed that these nomadic horsemen, accustomed to sweeping across flat, open plains, would have no interest in the treacherous, jagged peaks of the Alborz, nor the patience to besiege a fortress suspended in the clouds. It was a fatal, profound miscalculation. The Mongols were unlike any enemy the assassins had ever manipulated. They did not play the intricate political games of the Middle East. They did not honor diplomatic immunity, they did not recognize truces, and they absolutely did not understand the concept of a measured response. When the Mongols demanded submission, they meant total, absolute surrender of wealth, land, and dignity. Faced with this encroaching behemoth, the assassins instinctively reached for the only weapon they knew. They attempted to play their old game. They reached for the dagger. According to historical accounts, assassin envoys were dispatched, and strikes were ordered against Mongol commanders. The leaders of Alamut believed that if they could assassinate a few key generals, they could sow discord within the Mongol ranks, paralyze their leadership, and force them to turn their horses back toward the steppes. It was a strategy that had saved them a dozen times before. But killing a Seljuk vizier terrified a kingdom. Killing a Mongol envoy merely invited the wrath of a machine that viewed vengeance as a sacred, unalterable duty. The assassinations did not slow the Mongols down. They did not breed fear or paranoia in the hearts of the Khans. Instead, they provoked a cold, methodical fury. The Mongol war machine turned its vast, terrifying gaze upward, toward the eagle's nests. They did not view the assassins as a rival power to be negotiated with or a nuisance to be tolerated. They viewed them as an unacceptable obstacle in the path of total earthly conquest. And in the Mongol worldview, obstacles were not avoided. They were eradicated from the face of the earth. By the middle of the 13th century, the storm finally broke against the mountains of Persia. The assassins peered over their high stone battlements, expecting to see a disorganized horde of lightly armored horse archers milling about in frustration at the base of the cliffs. Instead, what they saw marching into their valleys froze the blood in their veins. The Mongols had not come alone. Following behind the tens of thousands of hardened cavalry were thousands of conscripted engineers from conquered Chinese and Persian cities. The Mongols were the undisputed masters of siege warfare. They brought with them the accumulated military technology of a conquered Asia. Down in the valleys, the invaders began to systematically strip the landscape bare. They hauled massive, heavy timbers up treacherous mountain passes, constructing immense, terrifying war machines right before the eyes of the defenders. Giant traction trebuchets, catapults, and towering siege engines were assembled piece by piece, perfectly calibrated to hurl devastation into the clouds. The assassins, who had always counted on time and geography to wear down their besiegers, suddenly found themselves trapped. The Mongols did not grow tired. They did not suffer from low morale. They set up their camps, positioned their engines of war, and prepared to tear the sky down upon the masters of the mountain. The age of the dagger was over. The age of the siege had begun. The silence of the Alborz mountains was shattered not by the battle cries of charging men, but by the colossal, agonizing groan of twisting timber and the sharp crack of heavy ropes pulled taut. For generations, the air above the deep Persian valleys had belonged exclusively to the eagles. Now, it was violently claimed by the Mongols. The bombardment began with a mechanical rhythm that was utterly devoid of human emotion. Massive Chinese traction trebuchets, hauled piece by piece across the continent and reassembled at the base of the cliffs, unleashed their fury. The sky darkened as boulders the size of draft horses were hurled upward, cresting the mountain peaks before crashing down upon the unassailable walls of the assassin strongholds. This was not a siege of starvation. It was an act of systematic, architectural obliteration. The stone walls that had absorbed the desperate assaults of Seljuk armies now shuddered, cracked, and splintered under the sheer kinetic force of the Mongol artillery. Inside the fortresses, the atmosphere shifted from defiant isolation to a paralyzing, claustrophobic dread. The devoted initiates of the order, men who had spent their entire adult lives mastering the intimate, silent art of the dagger, were forced to cower in the dust. They watched helplessly as their grand libraries shook, as their astronomical observatories were reduced to rubble, and as the protective shells of their sanctuaries were peeled away. Their unparalleled physical conditioning, their mastery of disguise, their absolute fearlessness in the face of death, none of it mattered. You cannot plunge a dagger into a falling boulder. You cannot terrorize a machine. The supreme architect of this destruction was Hulagu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan and the brother to the great Khan of the Mongol Empire. Hulagu did not possess the petty ambitions of the sultans and emirs the assassins were so accustomed to manipulating. He was not interested in securing a trade route, extracting tribute, or settling a theological dispute. He had been dispatched from the vast Mongolian steppes with a singular divine mandate: to conquer all of Western Asia and push the borders of the empire to the edge of the Mediterranean Sea. The assassins were merely an anomaly on his map, a localized infection of defiance that had to be cauterized before he could march his armies upon the ultimate prize of Baghdad. When assassin envoys desperately rode out from the besieged castles, waving banners of parley and offering terms of submission, Hulagu's response was chillingly absolute. He refused to negotiate. He executed the diplomats. He demanded nothing less than unconditional, total surrender and the physical dismantling of every stronghold the sect possessed. By the winter of 1256, the Mongol grip tightened around the throat of the assassin state. Hulagu brought his primary force directly to the base of the most legendary prize of all. He laid siege to the eagle's nest itself, Alamut. For the reigning leader of the order, Imam Rukan al-Din Kersha, the weight of centuries of history pressed down upon his shoulders. He was a young man, having recently inherited the leadership of a shadow empire that was rapidly disintegrating before his eyes. As the Mongol war machines relentlessly battered the lower defenses of Alamut and the smoke from burning outposts choked the valley, Kersha realized the horrifying truth. The divine protection they had believed in, the aura of invincibility that Hasan-i Sabbah had woven into the very stone of the fortress, was an illusion. The Mongols were going to wipe them from the face of the earth. He faced an impossible, agonizing choice. He could order his men to fight to the last drop of blood, ensuring the absolute annihilation of his people. Or he could do what no master of Alamut had ever done. He could bow. In December of 1256, the unthinkable occurred. The heavy, iron-reinforced gates of Alamut, which had defied the greatest empires of the Islamic world for nearly 170 years, slowly swung open. There was no final, glorious charge. There were no assassins leaping from the shadows. Imam Rukan al-Din Kersha walked down the winding mountain path and formally surrendered himself and his impregnable fortress to the Mongol warlord. The surrender of Alamut was the death knell of the assassin state in Persia. But Hulagu Khan was not a man who left jobs half-finished. A surrender was not enough. The legacy had to be eradicated. Once the Mongols entered the fortress, they unleashed a deliberate, calculated destruction designed to erase the Ismailis from the memory of the world. Hulagu's troops set their torches to the grand libraries of Alamut. In a matter of hours, a roaring inferno consumed one of the greatest collections of human knowledge in the medieval world. Priceless, irreplaceable manuscripts containing centuries of advanced mathematics, esoteric theology, alchemy, and Persian philosophy were reduced to grey ash that drifted aimlessly over the Alborz mountains. The intellectual soul of the order was burned out. The physical body of the fortress followed. Mongol engineers went to work dismantling the towering stone defenses, throwing the battlements down the sheer cliffs, shattering the granaries, and poisoning the secret cisterns. Alamut was torn apart so thoroughly that it would never again serve as a military stronghold. Other Persian fortresses of the sect quickly followed suit, surrendering one by one as the news of Alamut's fall spread like a contagion of despair. Those few commanders who stubbornly refused to yield were subjected to the full, unbridled horror of a Mongol sack. Their walls were broken, and every living soul inside was slaughtered without hesitation. The grand, terrifying empire of the mind that Hasan-i Sabbah had built was gone. The surviving members of the sect in Persia were forced to strip away their identities, abandoning their black robes and fleeing deep into the civilian populations of neighboring regions. They became refugees in their own lands, practicing their faith in absolute, terrifying secrecy, hunted like animals in the ruins of a conquered world. Yet, as Hulagu Khan turned his massive, victorious horde westward, preparing to unleash hell upon the caliph in Baghdad, he left one loose end entirely unresolved. Far across the burning deserts, separated from the wreckage of Persia by hundreds of miles of hostile territory, the jagged peaks of the Syrian mountains still held a secret. The western branch of the assassins, operating from the imposing walls of Masyaf, had watched the destruction of their Persian brothers from afar. They were isolated, utterly cut off from their roots, and surrounded by Crusaders and Muslim warlords who could smell the blood in the water. The head of the serpent had been severed, but the Syrian tail was still dangerously alive, and the shadow of the old man of the mountain had not yet vanished from the earth. To understand the sheer resilience of that shadow, one must look away from the smoldering ash of Persia and turn toward the rugged limestone spine of the An-Nusayriya mountains in Syria. Here, suspended above deep gorges and dense cedar forests, the fortress of Masyaf stood as the beating heart of the Western assassins. While Alamut had been the intellectual and spiritual cradle of the order, Masyaf was its battle-hardened frontier. It was a place forged in the ceaseless, grinding friction between the Crusader kingdoms to the west and the ambitious Muslim emirates to the east. And ruling over this perilous frontier was a figure who would elevate the terror of the sect to its absolute historical zenith. His name was Rashid ad-Din Sinan, though the terrified lords of Europe knew him simply and mythically as the Old Man of the Mountain. Sinan was not a native of Syria. He had been born in the shadow of Alamut, trained in its strict, ascetic disciplines, and steeped in the profound psychological warfare that defined the order. Long before the Mongols arrived to shatter the Persian strongholds, Sinan had been dispatched westward. His mission was to bring the fragmented, independent-minded Syrian castles firmly under the control of the central leadership. But Sinan was a man of extraordinary ambition, possessing an intellect so sharp and a charisma so overwhelming that he quickly transcended his role as a mere deputy. Once he seized control of Masyaf, Sinan operated with almost total independence. He ruled his mountain domain not merely as a commander, but as a sovereign, a diplomat, and in the eyes of his fiercely devoted followers, a man possessing nearly supernatural foresight. He understood that the survival of his people in the chaotic landscape of the Levant required a dangerous, ever-shifting dance. To survive, the Old Man of the Mountain had to play the greatest powers of the medieval world against one another without ever being crushed between them. But in the late 12th century, the geopolitical board was fundamentally altered. A new, terrifyingly capable player entered the arena. Rising from the fractured Muslim dynasties was a leader of unparalleled military brilliance and unifying vision. His name was Salah ad-Din, known to the West as Saladin. He was the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, a Kurdish warrior who had dedicated his life to a singular, monumental goal: uniting the fragmented Islamic world to drive the Crusaders back into the sea. To achieve this grand unification, Saladin required absolute obedience from every emir, governor, and warlord in the region. There could be no rogue states, no independent factions, and certainly no secretive, heretical sects operating from untouchable mountain fortresses. To Saladin, the assassins were a dangerous, unpredictable variable in his holy war. They had already demonstrated their willingness to ally with the Crusaders when it suited them, and their daggers had claimed the lives of several of his close allies. Saladin decided that the shadow of Masyaf had to be extinguished. In the year 1176, the greatest army in the Middle East marched into the An-Nusayriya mountains. Saladin laid siege to Masyaf, surrounding the fortress with hardened veterans, siege engines, and the vast resources of his newly forged empire. The Sultan intended to do what the Seljuks had failed to achieve in Persia. He meant to starve the assassins out, breach their walls, and end the legend of the old man of the mountain once and for all. Inside the high stone walls of Masyaf, Sinan did not panic. He knew that his small garrison could not defeat Saladin's army in open combat. He also knew that assassinating Saladin, a man revered across the Islamic world as a holy champion, might trigger a backlash so violent that it would result in the total extermination of the Ismaili people. Sinan needed to defeat the Sultan without killing him. He needed to execute a psychological checkmate. The events that followed blur the line between documented history and enduring legend, but the profound impact they had on the region is undeniable. According to the chronicles, Saladin's camp was heavily fortified. The Sultan slept in a grand pavilion at the center of the army, surrounded by rings of elite guards. Chalk and cinders were scattered on the ground outside his tent to reveal the footprints of any intruder. Saladin himself, acutely aware of the assassin's methods, slept lightly, a drawn sword always within arm's reach. Yet one night, the Sultan awoke to a chilling sensation. The heavy air of the tent felt suddenly, violently different. The guards outside had heard nothing. The chalk around the pavilion was entirely undisturbed. But as Saladin's eyes adjusted to the dim light of a flickering oil lamp, he saw it. Resting gently upon his chest, or according to some accounts, pinned to the cushion right beside his head, was a distinct, terrifyingly familiar object. It was a poisoned dagger, instantly recognizable as the work of the assassins. Beneath the blade lay a simple piece of parchment, bearing a message written by the old man of the mountain. The note was not a declaration of war, but a serene, terrifying statement of absolute control. It informed the most powerful sultan in the world that he was only alive because Sinan allowed it. It warned him that if he did not lift the siege of Masyaf immediately, the next dagger would not be left in a cushion. It would be buried in his heart. Some versions of the tale even mention hot, freshly baked scones, unique to the assassin's region, left beside the blade. A macabre domestic touch, proving the infiltrator had taken their time, moving through the royal tent with absolute, relaxed impunity. The psychological devastation of this act cannot be overstated. Saladin, the conqueror of nations, the unifier of the East, realized in the cold sweat of the night that all his armies, all his wealth, and all his elite guards were entirely useless against this enemy. If the old man of the mountain could bypass every defense to leave a warning, he could just as easily have left a corpse. The next morning, the grand siege of Masyaf was abruptly lifted. Saladin ordered his massive army to break camp and withdraw from the mountains. He sent peaceful envoys to Sinan, formally recognizing the sovereignty of the assassin territory and establishing a mutual truce that would hold for the remainder of his life. In a single, bloodless stroke, Rashid ad-Din Sinan had humbled the greatest monarch of the age, securing the survival of his people and elevating the mythos of the assassins to godlike proportions. The old man of the mountain had proven that true power does not always reside in the size of an army or the thickness of a castle wall. Sometimes, true power is simply the ability to command the shadows. For decades following this legendary encounter, the Syrian assassins thrived. They maintained their delicate, lethal balance, navigating the chaotic final chapters of the Crusades with the same ruthless pragmatism that had always defined them. But the world beyond their mountains was changing rapidly, shifting in ways that not even the brilliant mind of Sinan could have permanently forestalled. The Mongol storm that had incinerated Alamut in the east had not dissipated, it had merely paused. And a new, equally formidable empire was currently forging itself in the crucible of Egypt, a dynasty of warrior slaves known as the Mamluks, who would eventually turn their hardened, unforgiving eyes toward the limestone peaks of Syria. The assassins had survived the wrath of Saladin, but the ultimate test of their endurance was only just beginning. The smoke rising from the shattered ruins of Alamut did not simply vanish into the freezing winds of the Alborz mountains. It cast a long, suffocating shadow that stretched across the entirety of the Middle East. For the Syrian branch of the assassins, isolated within the limestone walls of Masyaf and its sister fortresses, the news of the mother stronghold's surrender was a psychological earthquake. For nearly 2 centuries, Alamut had been their spiritual compass, the undisputed center of their hidden universe. It was the reservoir of their esoteric knowledge and the seat of the Imam. Now, it was nothing more than a blackened scar on a mountaintop. The head of the serpent had been crushed beneath the hooves of the Mongol cavalry, leaving the Syrian strongholds as orphaned outposts in a world that was rapidly descending into an apocalypse. Hulagu Khan, having erased the mountain sanctuaries of Persia, did not pause to savor his victory. The destruction of the assassins was merely a violent prologue to his ultimate objective. His gaze, fixed and merciless, turned toward the crown jewel of the Islamic world, Baghdad. In 1258, the Mongol war machine descended upon the ancient capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. The city, which for 500 years had stood as a beacon of culture, science, and wealth, was subjected to a horror unparalleled in its history. The Mongols unleashed a storm of fire and blood that unmade the very fabric of the region. The grand libraries of Baghdad were emptied into the Tigris River, the ink bleeding from thousands of manuscripts until the waters ran black, before turning red with the blood of a slaughtered population. The Caliph himself, the symbolic head of Sunni Islam, was rolled into a carpet and trampled to death by Mongol horses, a brutal, calculated execution designed to avoid spilling royal blood on the earth, yet fundamentally shattering the political and spiritual order of the age. From their high towers in the An-Nusayriya mountains, the surviving assassin commanders watched this total collapse of the old world with a chilling realization. If the ancient, revered walls of Baghdad could be flattened, and if the Caliph himself could be casually crushed beneath the hooves of foreign cavalry, what hope did a handful of isolated mountain fortresses have? The delicate balance of power that had allowed the assassins to thrive, the endless, predictable friction between Crusader kings and Muslim sultans, was being completely swept away. The Mongol vanguard began pushing inexorably into Syria, bringing the stench of burning cities with them. The assassins braced for the inevitable siege, knowing that the Chinese trebuchets that had shattered Alamut would soon be hauled up their own cliffs. The era of the dagger seemed utterly meaningless in the face of an enemy that intended to burn the entire world to ash. But history, in its relentless unpredictability, offered a sudden, violent pivot. The Mongol tide was about to break against a wall of iron it had not anticipated. Rising from the south, out of the blistering deserts of Egypt, came a new, ferociously capable empire. They were the Mamluks, an elite military caste of former slave soldiers who had overthrown their masters to forge a ruthless, highly disciplined state. Hardened by a lifetime of brutal martial training, the Mamluk cavalry rode north to meet the invincible Mongols. In the late summer of 1260, at the momentous Battle of Ain Jalut in the Jezreel Valley, the impossible happened. The Mamluks stood their ground. In a clash of unparalleled ferocity, they shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility, crushing the eastern invaders and driving the remnants of their army out of the Levant. For a brief, fleeting moment, the assassins of Masyaf might have believed they had been saved by divine providence. The Mongol threat had been repelled from their immediate borders, but the relief was an illusion, a cruel trick of geopolitics. They had merely traded an apocalypse of fire for a slow, suffocating strangulation. The victor of Ain Jalut, a brilliant and utterly merciless Mamluk general who would soon seize the throne as Sultan Baybars, was now the undisputed master of the Levant. Baybars was a conqueror forged in the same brutal crucible as Saladin, but he lacked the earlier sultan's willingness to compromise. Where Saladin had ultimately respected the terrifying autonomy of the old man of the mountain, agreeing to a tense truce after a dagger was left in his tent, Baybars operated with a cold, absolute intolerance for rivals. Sultan Baybars recognized that the assassins were severely weakened. Cut off from Persian reinforcements, geographically isolated, and psychologically battered by the loss of their spiritual leaders, the Syrian fortresses were vulnerable. Baybars did not intend to lay a costly, prolonged siege to Masyaf, nor did he wish to destroy the sect completely. He was too pragmatic a warlord to discard such a potent weapon. Instead of eradicating the assassins, Baybars resolved to own them. The Mamluk Sultan initiated a systematic campaign of geopolitical suffocation. He began to demand heavy tributes from the mountain fortresses, extorting their wealth, while simultaneously stripping away their surrounding agricultural lands. He intercepted their supply lines and isolated them from potential Crusader allies. Slowly, methodically, the Mamluk state tightened its grip around the throat of the assassin order. When the leadership of Masyaf attempted to resist, clinging desperately to the fierce independence that had defined them for nearly 2 centuries, Baybars responded with overwhelming, suffocating force. But he did not just use his armies. He used their own fractured politics against them. The Sultan interfered directly in the internal succession of the sect, deposing stubborn commanders and installing puppet leaders who were entirely subservient to the throne in Cairo. The humiliation was profound. The feared devotees of the mountain, the men whose predecessors had struck down viziers in broad daylight and terrified kings in their beds, were reduced to mere instruments of the Mamluk state. Sultan Baybars forbade them from undertaking any assassinations without his explicit royal decree. The independence of the shadows had been broken. The assassins were no longer an invisible, autonomous empire of fear. They were now simply another division of the Egyptian military apparatus, a state-sponsored guild of executioners deployed against Baybars' political rivals and Crusader enemies. When a high-profile target fell to a hidden blade in the late 13th century, the courts of Europe no longer whispered in terror about the old man of the mountain. They cursed the Sultan of Egypt. Inside the cold, limestone halls of Masyaf, the atmosphere grew heavy with the weight of this subjugation. The strict, ascetic discipline established by Hasan-i Sabbah remained, and the lethal skills of the initiates were still sharp, but the divine purpose that had fueled them was fading. They were no longer fighting for the survival of a hidden, righteous community. They were fighting for the political ambitions of a foreign king who despised their faith but valued their daggers. The fortresses that had once stood as defiant sanctuaries against the tides of history had become gilded cages. The assassins still possessed their lethal bite, but the leash was firmly held by Cairo. As the final decades of the 13th century approached, bringing with them the complete and utter expulsion of the Crusader kingdoms from the Holy Land, the men of the mountain prepared to fade entirely into the background of an empire they could no longer control. As the 13th century began its final, frantic descent, the once fearsome autonomy of the Syrian assassins had been systematically hollowed out. The fortresses that had once commanded the terror of kings were now little more than garrisoned outposts for the Mamluk Sultanate. The men who resided within these stone walls, while still rigorously trained in the art of the blade, found themselves bound by the political dictates of Cairo, their lethal expertise repurposed as a tool of state-sponsored enforcement rather than an instrument of spiritual survival. The geopolitical landscape of the Levant was undergoing its most violent transformation in generations. Sultan Baybars, having shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility, turned his undivided attention toward the final eradication of the Crusader states. City after city, Antioch, Tripoli, and eventually the coastal hubs, fell to the inexorable advance of the Mamluk war machine. In this campaign of total conquest, there was no room for independent sects or shadowy, unaccountable alliances. The assassins, stripped of their agency, were forced to watch from their high mountain perches as the very powers they had spent centuries balancing against one another were obliterated by the new masters of Egypt. Life inside Masyaf and its sister strongholds grew increasingly hollow, while the ancient, ascetic rituals of Hasan-i Sabbah continued in the darkened halls. The fervor that had once defined the Brotherhood had been replaced by a quiet, pervasive resignation. They had transitioned from being the vanguard of a hidden, righteous community to being the internal enforcers of a foreign regime that viewed them with profound suspicion. The Old Man of the Mountain, a title that had once carried the weight of a mythic, unstoppable force, was now effectively a vestigial office, its occupant serving as a liaison to the Mamluk authorities rather than an independent sovereign. Their daggers, though still sharp, were rarely drawn against the enemies of their faith. Instead, they were employed in the service of mundane political assassinations, targeting the rivals of Baybars or the remnants of the Crusader nobility in a desperate, degrading attempt to preserve their dwindling influence. Every strike they performed served to further alienate them from the populace and entrench them deeper into the political machinery of their oppressors. By the time the Crusader presence in the Holy Land was reduced to a few isolated, trembling bastions, the assassins had effectively ceased to exist as a meaningful political force. Their fortresses, no longer vital to the defense of the region against foreign invasion, were slowly marginalized by the Mamluks. The strategic necessity that had once protected their independence had vanished, and with it, their shield against total assimilation. As the era of the Crusades came to its bloody, definitive end, the Syrian assassins found themselves at a crossroads of oblivion. They were a relic of a vanished world, a secret order whose secrets were no longer hidden and whose power had been long ago bartered away for the sake of mere existence. The proud, terrifying legacy of the Eagle's Nest, a legacy of defiance, intellectual rigor, and calculated violence, was being steadily buried under the mundane bureaucracy of a new imperial age. The stage was now set for the final, ignominious chapter of their existence. Having survived the Mongol Holocaust and the Mamluk subjugation, the sect was about to face its most difficult challenge yet: the slow, inevitable erosion of relevance in a region that had moved past the need for shadow dwellers. The fires of Alamut had been extinguished long ago, and now the embers of Masyaf were finally beginning to grow cold. The physical empire of the dagger had finally been broken, ground into the dust by the relentless machinery of Mamluk bureaucracy and Mongol iron. The high, windswept watchtowers of Masyaf, once the undisputed domain of the Old Man of the Mountain, now flew the banners of Cairo. The men who walked those cold stone corridors were no longer the sovereign architects of medieval terror. They were subdued vassals, their legendary lethal arts tethered to the political whims of a foreign sultan. To a casual observer in the dying days of the 13th century, it appeared that the assassins had been entirely erased from the grand chessboard of history. But history is rarely so simple, and true terror is not bound by physical walls. As the actual, flesh and blood initiates of the order faded into forced obscurity, something else broke free from the limestone peaks of Syria. It was an ephemeral contagion, far more resilient than any fortress of stone and timber. While the Mongols and Mamluks had successfully destroyed the body of the assassin state, they had inadvertently allowed its phantom to escape. This phantom did not travel on horseback, nor did it march with an army. It traveled in the shattered minds and haunted memories of the retreating Crusaders. In the spring of 1291, the great coastal fortress of Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold in the Levant, fell to the overwhelming forces of the Mamluk Sultanate. The Christian dream of holding the Holy Land was violently extinguished. The surviving knights, barons, and foot soldiers were driven into the sea, scrambling aboard cramped wooden galleys to flee westward across the Mediterranean. They left behind their conquered castles, their fallen brothers, and their holy relics in the burning sands of the east. Yet, as these battered armadas sailed back toward the shores of Italy, France, and England, their cargo holds carried an invisible, insidious export. They brought back the legend of the shadows. When these hardened veterans returned to the cold, damp castles of Europe, they were greeted as men who had walked through the fires of hell. As they sat beside roaring hearths during the freezing European winters, surrounded by wide-eyed nobles and anxious clergy, they recounted their catastrophic failures. But a towering, fully armored European knight, a man trained from birth to believe in the absolute supremacy of heavy cavalry and Christian steel, could not easily explain how his mighty armies had been paralyzed by a handful of men armed with nothing but short blades. To admit that they had been outmaneuvered by the sheer tactical brilliance and unshakable devotion of an obscure Islamic sect was a humiliating impossibility. The Crusaders needed a narrative that made sense of their visceral, paralyzing fear. They needed to explain the inexplicable. They needed monsters. And so, the myth-making began. In the flickering firelight of European great halls, the political pragmatism and absolute ascetic discipline of Hasan-i Sabbah and Rashid ad-Din Sinan were stripped away. The complex, highly educated Ismaili scholars who had debated astronomy and philosophy on the peaks of Alamut were entirely overwritten. In their place, the returning Crusaders painted a lurid, terrifying portrait of mindless, supernatural fanaticism. The storytellers wove a dark alchemy of truth and frantic imagination. They spoke in hushed, trembling voices of a secretive, demonic cult hiding in the inaccessible clouds of the east. They described an all-powerful sorcerer king, the old man of the mountain, who possessed a terrifying, godlike control over the minds of his followers. But the most potent, enduring element of this newly forged myth was the explanation for the assassin's lack of fear. The European mind could not comprehend a warrior who willingly embraced absolute destruction without the promise of earthly reward or conventional battlefield glory. To reconcile this, a dark and intoxicating rumor was born, likely pieced together from earlier, hostile Sunni propaganda and violently exaggerated by Western paranoia. The Crusaders began to whisper that the absolute loyalty of these killers was not born of faith, but of dark intoxication. They claimed that the initiates were heavily drugged, fed a potent, mind-altering concoction of hashish that stripped away their humanity and numbed them to all physical pain. According to these wildly spinning tales, the drugged initiates were carried in a deep stupor into a hidden, walled garden built to perfectly mimic the Islamic conception of paradise. In this secret Eden, suspended high in the mountains, they were surrounded by flowing fountains of wine, exotic, intoxicating perfumes, and beautiful maidens. After tasting these earthly delights, they were drugged once more, cast back out into the cold, harsh stone of the fortress, and told by their master that they had experienced a genuine glimpse of the afterlife. The only way to return to that eternal garden, the master promised, was to obey his commands without question and die in the execution of his will. It was a brilliant, terrifying, and almost entirely fabricated narrative. There is no serious historical or archaeological evidence to suggest that Hasan-i Sabbah, a man who strictly executed his own son for a minor infraction of ascetic law, ever permitted the use of intoxicating drugs or constructed lavish pleasure gardens within the freezing, austere walls of his mountain fortresses. But truth has never been a prerequisite for a compelling legend. The story of the drugged, brainwashed killers in a hidden mountain paradise struck a profound psychological chord in the West. It was exotic, it was terrifying, and most importantly, it offered a comforting excuse. It allowed the mighty lords of Europe to justify the terror that had kept them awake in their heavily guarded tents. They had not been bested by mere men. They had been fighting drugged demons. This twisted narrative spread with the speed of a plague. It leaped from the chronicles of returning knights into the vibrant, expanding tapestry of European folklore, the word used by the sect's bitterest Muslim enemies, *hashishin*, a derogatory term likely meant to brand them as low-class outcasts or rabble, was violently mangled by European tongues. In the mouths of French barons, Italian merchants, and English kings, *hashishin* gradually smoothed out. The syllables shifted, hardened, and settled into a new, permanent shape in the Western lexicon. *assassin. It was a linguistic conquest, far greater than any military victory the sect had ever achieved. The word shed its specific geographical and religious origins, transforming from a proper noun, identifying a persecuted Ismaili minority, into a universal, dark descriptor. It became the definitive term for a shadow killer, a professional murderer who strikes down prominent figures for political or religious motives. Every time a monarch was struck down in the dark, every time a rival lord was poisoned at a banquet, the ghost of the mountain was summoned. While the actual Ismaili survivors in Persia and Syria were living in quiet desperation, hiding their faith and trying to avoid the wrath of their conquerors, their phantom had conquered the imagination of the Western world. They had become the ultimate boogeymen of the medieval era. The stage was now perfectly set for the myth to be immortalized. The whispers of the Crusaders had laid the foundation of fear, but it would take a different kind of traveler, a man whose words would be bound in leather and read by kings, to permanently cement the legend of the assassins into the bedrock of global history. The shadows were about to be captured in ink by the most famous merchant to ever walk the Silk Road. The year is 1273, and a young Venetian merchant is making his slow, arduous way across the sprawling, unforgiving expanse of the Silk Road. His name is Marco Polo. Accompanied by his father and uncle, he is traversing the desolate, wind-scoured highlands of Persia, a landscape still deeply scarred by the apocalyptic passage of the Mongol hordes. As their caravan navigates the treacherous mountain passes, they journey through the very valleys where the shadow of Alamut had once reigned supreme. The physical destruction of the assassin state is still fresh. Barely 17 years have passed since Hulagu Khan ordered the Eagle's Nest dismantled. The colossal ruins of the fortresses are still visible, jutting into the sky like the jagged, broken teeth of a defeated giant. The physical threat of the dagger is gone, entirely replaced by the absolute authority of the Mongol Empire. But as Marco Polo rests by the campfires in the valleys of Dalam, the air remains thick with whispers. Polo is a man with an insatiable, almost dangerous appetite for the exotic, the bizarre, and the theatrical. He listens intently to the terrified folklore of the local villagers and the boastful, exaggerated tales of the Mongol garrison guards. He hears fragments of truth, the absolute loyalty of the initiates, the precision of their strikes, the austere discipline of Hasan-i Sabbah. But these fragments have already been twisted by time, trauma, and the natural human desire to turn history into myth. What Marco Polo gathers from the dust of Persia is not a dry, historical account of a persecuted Ismaili sect fighting for theological survival. He absorbs the ghost story. He takes the lingering Crusader rumors of the old man of the mountain, blends them seamlessly with the terrified local Persian myths of the mountain, and filters it all through the highly romanticized, dramatic lens of a European storyteller eager to captivate a Western audience. Decades later, locked inside a damp, stone prison cell in Genoa, Marco Polo will dictate his memoirs to a fellow captive. The resulting manuscript, *The Travels of Marco Polo*, will become one of the most influential books in human history. and within its heavy, leather-bound pages, he dedicates a vivid, unforgettable chapter to the assassins, a chapter that will permanently lock the myth into the bedrock of global imagination. In Polo's telling, the Old Man of the Mountain is not a brilliant political strategist or a devout, religious scholar. He is a sinister, almost magical tyrant who has constructed a literal, physical paradise in a hidden, lush valley nestled between two unscalable mountains. Polo's prose paints a picture of overwhelming, intoxicating sensory overload. He describes a secret garden flowing freely with conduits of wine, milk, honey, and pure water. He writes of pavilions built of gold and exquisite silk, surrounded by the world's most beautiful maidens. These women, according to Polo, were trained to sing with the voices of angels, to dance with hypnotic grace, and to play every instrument known to man, existing solely to ravish the senses of anyone who stepped foot inside the valley. But the most devastating part of Polo's account is his detailed explanation of how the assassins were forged. He writes that the old man would gather the fierce, young men of the surrounding mountains and speak to them of the paradise promised by the prophet. Then he would administer a powerful, mind-altering potion, a heavy draught of hashish that plunged the young men into a deep, death-like slumber. While they were entirely unconscious, they were carried through a secret, heavily guarded entrance and placed gently upon the soft grass of the hidden garden. When the young men awoke, Polo claims, their senses were immediately assaulted by perfection. Surrounded by flowing wine, intoxicating perfumes, and beautiful maidens who catered to their every whim, they genuinely believed they had crossed the threshold of mortality. They believed, with every fiber of their being, that they were in heaven. After a few days of uninhibited, unimaginable bliss, the old man would drug them again. They would wake up back in the cold, harsh, barren stone of the fortress, the memory of paradise burning like a brand in their minds. When they wept and begged to return, the old man offered them a simple, terrifying bargain. To return to the garden forever, they simply had to carry out his assassinations. If they died in the act, angels would immediately carry their souls back to the pavilions of gold. It was a brilliantly terrifying narrative of psychological manipulation and dark magic, and the Western world consumed it entirely. Long before the invention of the printing press, Marco Polo's manuscript was painstakingly copied by hand, translated into multiple languages, and passed among the courts of Europe. For the kings, barons, merchants, and clergy of the West, this chapter was not read as a fable. It was accepted as absolute, geographic fact. It offered a neat, thrilling explanation for the terror that had plagued the Crusades. The Crusaders had not been outsmarted by a superior geopolitical strategy. They had been fighting drugged, brainwashed zealots controlled by an Eastern wizard. The book permanently cemented the word asterisk, assassin asterisk, in the Western mind. It stripped the order of its humanity, its religious nuance, and its desperate struggle for survival, reducing them to a two-dimensional caricature of hedonism and murder. The myth had become far more powerful and far more immortal than the reality ever was. Yet, there is a profound, crushing irony to this literary triumph. If we pull the lens back from the grand courts of Europe, where noblemen gasped at Polo's tales of wine-filled fountains and mind control, and look at the actual reality of the Middle East in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the contrast is heartbreaking. The true descendants of Alamut were not resting in pavilions of gold. They were living in abject poverty and constant, suffocating fear. The remnants of the Ismaili community were hiding in plain sight, practicing asterisk tachia asterisk, the theological principle of concealing one's true beliefs in times of extreme peril, to avoid execution at the hands of the ruling Mamluks or the Ilkhanate Mongols. The former lords of the mountain adopted the outward practices of their Sunni or Twelver-Shia neighbors. They were a shattered, fragmented people. They held their secret gatherings in dark basements, whispering their prayers so the neighbors would not hear. They hid their few surviving sacred texts beneath the floorboards of modest homes. The men who had once commanded the fate of empires were now humble weavers, farmers, and merchants, terrified that a careless word might reveal their lineage and bring a sword down upon their families. While the entire world celebrated and feared a monstrous, fictionalized version of their ancestors, the actual people of the mountain were desperately trying not to be erased from existence. The legend had now entirely eclipsed the reality. The world had fallen in love with the shadow, while the body that cast it was bleeding out in the dirt. But what happens to a community when their true history is burned? Their fortresses are broken, and they are forced to live inside the hollow, terrifying shell of a monster's reputation. As the centuries roll forward, the silent survivors of the assassin order must learn how to navigate an era where their name is universally famous, but their profound, tragic truth is entirely forgotten. The centuries following the fall of Alamut and Masyaf are characterized by a profound, heavy silence. The grand theaters of history, the blood-soaked battlefields of the Levant, and the shifting, volatile borders of the Persian plateau were now occupied by new, towering titans. The Mamluks, the Ottomans, the Safavids, and eventually the mighty Moguls of India would violently carve up the known world. Their massive armies marched back and forth over the very earth where the assassins had once ruled the shadows. But beneath the deafening thunder of these new empires, the descendants of Hasan-i Sabbah were executing the most difficult, agonizing, and prolonged mission their order had ever undertaken. The mission of simple, quiet endurance. To the outside world, and certainly to the historians of the triumphant empires, the sect appeared to have vanished completely. They seemed swallowed by the shifting sands of time and the brutal, mechanical efficiency of the Mongol and Mamluk conquests. But the Ismaili community had not been extinguished. They had simply submerged. The absolute iron discipline that had once been used to train men for lethal strikes in crowded marketplaces was now redirected entirely toward a single goal: the preservation of their faith. In the remote, dusty villages of Persia and the isolated, rocky valleys of Syria, the survivors practiced *tachia*, the sacred, theological act of concealing one's true beliefs to protect one's life. It was a camouflage far more sophisticated and far more demanding than any physical disguise worn by their dagger-wielding ancestors. To survive, they had to become ghosts within their own homes. They attended the grand mosques of their Sunni or 12 Shia rulers. They recited the acceptable prayers, paid the necessary taxes, and blended flawlessly into the background of whatever empire claimed dominion over them. They learned to speak the language of orthodoxy while keeping the flame of their true identity burning in the deepest, most inaccessible chambers of their hearts. Generations passed. The memory of the dagger slowly began to rust. Fathers passed down the esoteric knowledge of their faith to their sons in the dead of night, speaking in hushed whispers behind bolted doors and heavy, shuttered windows. The grand, sprawling libraries of Alamut had been reduced to ash by Hulagu Khan, but the human mind became the new, indestructible archive. Sacred texts and philosophical treatises that had been smuggled out of the burning fortresses were painstakingly copied in secret, hidden beneath wooden floorboards or buried in clay jars in the desert sand. This was no longer a story of political terror or geopolitical manipulation. It was a story of profound, agonizing resilience. Every day lived in secret was a quiet rebellion against the empires that had sought to erase them. As the world slowly moved out of the medieval era, a slow, remarkable migration began. Seeking relief from the endless cycles of persecution and suspicion in the Middle East, small groups of Ismailis began to travel eastward. They followed the ancient, winding trade routes, crossing unforgiving mountains and deserts, eventually weaving themselves into the vast, complex tapestry of the Indian subcontinent. There, taking on new cultural identities and finding rare pockets of tolerance, The community began to slowly exhale. In these new lands, the transformation of the order became absolute. The harsh, austere militarism required to hold a mountain fortress against a besieging army was no longer necessary. The physical warfare of the medieval era was replaced by a purely spiritual and intellectual struggle. The descendants of the men who had struck down viziers and terrified Crusader kings began to build businesses instead of castles. They became merchants, scholars, and artisans. They integrated into the fabric of the societies that hosted them, abandoning entirely the politics of the blade. It is one of history's most astonishing, unspoken metamorphoses. Today, if you were to look for the descendants of the feared assassins, you will not find them hiding in fortified eagles' nests, nor will you find them training in the deadly, silent arts of stealth. You will find the Nizari Ismaili community, a vibrant, global population numbering in the millions. They are a community defined not by violence, but by a profound, institutional commitment to education, philanthropy, and cultural pluralism. The modern Ismaili faith bears absolutely no resemblance to the blood-soaked, terrifying reputation of its medieval ancestors. Where their forebears once built fortresses to keep the hostile world out, the modern community builds hospitals, funds vast international development networks, and establishes universities across the developing world. Their spiritual leadership advocates tirelessly for peace, the preservation of historical architecture, and the alleviation of global poverty. To observe this modern, constructive community is to witness the ultimate, paradoxical victory of Hasan-i Sabbah's original vision. He had set out to create a sanctuary for his persecuted people. The sanctuary they eventually found was not built of stone on a Persian mountaintop, nor was it defended by the edge of a poisoned dagger. The true sanctuary was found in their ability to adapt, to evolve, and to intellectually outlast the violent paradigms of the medieval world. Yet, an invisible, unbreakable thread of continuity links the modern philanthropic organizations back to the freezing, austere halls of Alamut. The incredible resilience required to survive centuries of persecution, the unwavering devotion to their spiritual lineage, and the intense, almost fierce focus on education and intellectual growth. All of these traits were forged in the crucible of the Alborz Mountains. The scholars of Alamut, who debated astronomy and mathematics while surrounded by hostile Seljuk armies, were the intellectual ancestors of the modern Ismaili students studying in the universities of Europe and Asia. The irony of this historical arc is profound and almost poetic. The mighty, world-spanning empires that sought to crush them, the Seljuks who hunted them through the valleys, the heavily armored Crusaders who fought them in the Levant, the Mongols who burned their libraries to ash, and the Mamluks who humiliated and subjugated them, have all crumbled into dust. Their absolute monarchs are dead, their towering stone walls are ruined, and their vast, invincible armies are nothing more than footnotes fading in dusty history books. But the small, persecuted community they tried so desperately to erase not only survived, but thrived. They stepped out of the shadows, shed the blood-soaked mantle of their past, and evolved into a powerful force for constructive, humanitarian change in the modern world. The dagger, once the most feared weapon on Earth, was ultimately laid down. But the resilience of the people who once wielded it proved stronger than any empire, while the physical descendants of the Order walked a path of quiet peace and constructive growth. The phantom of their past embarked on an entirely different journey. The legend of the assassin had slipped its chains. It was no longer tethered to the rugged peaks of Persia or the limestone valleys of Syria, nor was it constrained by the intricate religious doctrines of the medieval era. The myth had become a living, breathing entity of its own, feeding on the collective imagination of the world. As centuries bled into one another, the image of the Shadow Walker mutated. The exaggerated accounts of medieval travelers, transcribed by candlelight in European monasteries, were discovered by new generations. Artists, poets, and playwrights of the Renaissance and beyond seized upon these dark, romanticized tales. They were fascinated by the theatricality of the order, the concept of a secretive brotherhood bound by blood and oath, operating just beyond the edge of the firelight. The assassin became an archetype. They were stripped of their historical reality as desperate, persecuted survivors and reimagined as the ultimate agents of chaos and control. They became the unseen hand that steered the fate of empires, the silent guardians of ancient, forbidden knowledge, and the hooded phantoms who delivered justice or doom from the rooftops. This fascination did not fade with the dawn of the modern age. If anything, it accelerated. Today, nearly 1,000 years after Hasan-i Sabbah first laid eyes on the eagle's nest, the ghosts of his initiates still haunt our cultural consciousness. They move through the pages of our most celebrated novels. They command the silver screens of our cinemas, and they leap across the sprawling, meticulously rendered digital landscapes of our video games. In these modern tales, they are depicted as masters of stealth, romantic rebels fighting against Templars and tyrants, draped in white hoods and striking from the shadows. These contemporary portrayals bear almost no resemblance to the cold, ascetic, mathematical reality of the medieval sect. Hasan-i Sabbah would likely not recognize the fictionalized warriors who now carry his legacy. Yet, this endless pop culture immortality testifies to something far more profound than mere historical inaccuracy. It speaks to a deep, primal, and entirely universal human obsession. Why, across vastly different cultures and across the span of centuries, do we remain so captivated by the idea of the assassin? The answer lies in the deeply unsettling, yet thrilling truth they represented. The assassins embodied the terrifying realization that human power is inherently fragile. They proved that no matter how vast an empire becomes, no matter how many thousands of heavy cavalry a sultan commands, and no matter how thick a king builds his fortress walls, absolute security is an illusion. Throughout human history, the masses have been ruled by the mighty, by monarchs who claimed divine right, by warlords who ruled by the sword, by elites who seemed untouchable. The assassins shattered that untouchability. They demonstrated that the most powerful man in the world, surrounded by an ocean of guards, could still be humbled by a single, determined individual willing to sacrifice everything. They proved that a dagger in the night could do what an army of 10,000 could not. This idea is incredibly potent. It is the ultimate nightmare of the powerful and the secret, whispered fantasy of the powerless. The assassins represented the ultimate equalizer in an age of absolute tyranny. They force us to confront the uncomfortable reality that power is never truly absolute. It only exists until someone is brave enough or fanatical enough to walk through the shadows and take it. As we look back upon their long, turbulent history, we are forced to grapple with the profound duality of their nature. To study the assassins is to look into a mirror reflecting the extreme edges of the human condition. They were undeniably ruthless. They weaponized psychological terror. They spilled blood in the sacred confines of mosques and churches, and they introduced a form of targeted political violence that still plagues our modern world. They were the destroyers of peace, men who brought the nightmare of sudden death into the waking world of their enemies. But they were also magnificent survivors. They were a brilliant, highly educated community of philosophers, astronomers, and theologians who built breathtaking sanctuaries in the clouds. They preserved rare, esoteric knowledge in an age of burning libraries. They were deeply devoted brothers who bound themselves together in fierce loyalty to protect their families and their faith from the overwhelming, crushing tides of orthodox empires that sought to erase them. They were both the darkness and the light of their brutal century. They were fanatics and scholars, murderers and martyrs, villains and victims. In their spectacular rise and their devastating fall, we see the endless, agonizing struggle of humanity itself. We see the desperate will to endure against impossible odds, the intoxicating, corrupting temptation of holding power over life and death, and the lengths to which the human spirit will go to find meaning in a world dominated by shifting, violent empires. Their physical empire has been gone for centuries. The great sultans they terrorized are dust, and the Crusaders they fought have faded into romanticized myths of chivalry. But the physical remnants of the assassin state have not entirely vanished from the earth. To truly understand the final, lingering echo of their story, we must leave the realm of myth and modern imagination. We must travel back across the centuries, back across the vast, burning deserts, and begin a slow, quiet ascent. We must return, one last time, to the jagged, freezing peaks of the Alborz mountains, to stand amidst the ruins of where it all began, and listen to the silence that the Mongols left behind. High in the Alborz mountains of modern-day Iran, the air is thin, cold, and profoundly still. The winding, treacherous path that leads up to the rock of Alamut has not grown any less forgiving with the passage of 1,000 years. To climb its steep slopes today is to walk in the invisible footsteps of the devoted, feeling the same burning in the lungs and the same creeping sense of isolation that the initiates felt centuries ago. But when a traveler finally crests the summit, breathing heavily in the thin mountain air, they are not met by the imposing, iron-banded gates of an impenetrable fortress. There are no black-robed sentries scanning the horizon. There is no master of the mountain waiting in a high stone tower. There is only stone. The ruins of Alamut cling desperately to the jagged rock, an architectural skeleton bleached by the sun and scoured by the brutal winter snows. Visitors who make the arduous trek find little more than crumbling foundations, scattered masonry, and the shallow, haunting depressions of what might once have been grand cisterns or vast, subterranean granaries. The magnificent libraries that once held the accumulated wisdom of the Islamic world are gone without a trace. The high battlements that defied the Seljuk Empire have long since been thrown down into the yawning valleys below. Yet, standing upon this lonely, windswept peak, looking out over the endless, majestic expanse of the mountain range, it is remarkably easy to let the present day slip away. The silence of the place is not empty. It is heavy with the weight of echoes. If you close your eyes and let the freezing wind brush against your face, you can almost hear the sharp snap of the assassin banners fluttering against the grey sky. You can almost see the solitary watchmen standing rigid on the walls, their eyes fixed on the distant, dusty plains, waiting for the march of hostile armies. You can almost imagine the faint, intoxicating scent of the hidden gardens that may have existed only in the terrified imaginations of European kings, or perhaps bloomed beautifully right here upon this barren rock. The physical devastation of Alamut is a stark, absolute reminder of a universal truth. No fortress is eternal. Even the most formidable powers, the most untouchable empires, and the most feared brotherhoods eventually fade into whispers. But the desolate stones of the eagle's nest are also a testament to something far more resilient than castle walls. They are a monument to the terrifying, indestructible endurance of memory. The Mongol war machines shattered the limestone, and Hulagu Khan burned the manuscripts, but they could not destroy the story. The narrative of the assassins escaped the flames. And so, as the shadows lengthen across the Persian valleys, and the night begins to settle over the mountains, we are left with the lingering image of a people who dared to defy the gravity of their age. They were a small, persecuted community who looked at the overwhelming, crushing machinery of medieval empires and refused to be ground into dust. They believed that absolute faith, unbreakable discipline, and calculated fear could be wielded like a surgeon's blade. They built sanctuaries in the clouds, carving their defiance into the very bones of the earth, and they fought desperately against the shifting, violent tides of history. They succeeded, brilliantly and terrifyingly for a time. And then, like all empires of stone and mind, they were swept away. But their legend has outlived their conquerors by centuries. Their name is carried in every language of the modern world. Their story is woven into every tale of secret orders, hidden daggers, and the mysterious forces that operate just beyond the edge of our waking vision. The assassins remind us that the grand, sprawling tapestry of history is not only woven in the sunlit courts of kings and the thunderous charges of conquerors. It is also written in the dark. It is shaped by those who fight from the margins, who endure as long as they possibly can, and who leave behind echoes so powerful that 1,000 years of wind and rain cannot wash them away. Their physical time on this earth is gone, but their shadow refuses to die. Thank you for joining me on this long, winding journey through the shadows of history. This has been the Bedtime Historian, where the turbulent, dramatic events of the past are brought back to life, simply to guide your mind into a place of quiet rest. If you found yourself lost in tonight's story, let the echoes of the mountain fade gently away. Until our next journey into the past, close your eyes, let go of the waking world, and sleep well.